Hello, friends. My name is HannaLore Hein, and I am the state historian with the Idaho State Historical Society. And I am here today to bring to you a presentation about Idaho women and the suffrage movement. As you can likely see from the bottom of your screen, I am recording today's presentation from my home office. So I am literally bringing Idaho history from my home to your home, or your living room, or your front porch, wherever you might be enjoying this presentation when you decide to tune in and watch. So if you have any questions throughout, you can reach out to the Idaho State Historical Society with those questions. We are on all of the social media channels, and we are also responding to emails and phone calls. So we would love to hear your feedback. I'm going to cover the camera for the remainder of the presentation so that you really have a chance to engage with the content that is on the slides, as well as the story that I'm going to be bringing to you today. So I hope you enjoy. So as I said, today's presentation is going to feature content on the history of Idaho women and the suffrage movement, both here within the state and also nationally. And we are celebrating suffrage this year in particular because 2020 marks the centennial, or the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And that language from that 19th Amendment states that the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And with that language, and really because of this momentous event in history, the Idaho State Historical Society and Idaho Women in Leadership, another Idaho-based entity, they are nonpartisan, nonprofit, really focused on bringing more women into politics and into leadership in business across the state. These two organizations came together to establish the Idaho Women 100 initiative. And this initiative is really taking the year 2020 to commemorate the courageous women from Idaho's past who were instrumental in bringing suffrage to women here in the state. But it also recognizes that because women received the vote, we were able to go on and do really remarkable and incredible things, and that momentum is still present today, and that it will carry us into the future, and really that because we have women leaders today, we have an unlimited potential moving forward as a state. So that's the impetus behind Idaho Women 100 and really why we're bringing this presentation to you today. But of course, here in Idaho, we actually have more than 100 years of suffrage history to commemorate and to celebrate. Idaho became the fourth state in the Union to extend suffrage to women. We did that in 1896 via a state constitutional amendment. And at that point, we joined the ranks of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah as suffrage states. And so I'll get into more of the details on that later on in the presentation. So again, kind of to provide some context around this story, when people think about the era of women's suffrage, we typically think of a start date of 1848, which is when the first Women's Rights Convention met in Seneca Falls, New York, and really launched the women's suffrage movement, to 1920, when on August 18th of that year, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the proposed women's suffrage amendment, which of course is today known as the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But in history, you know, it's challenging to really establish an official start or stop date on most things. You could say that there are typically exceptions to the rule. And so, of course, here in this story, there are exceptions to this rule. Even as far back as colonial times, there were women outliers typically that, you know, were really vocal about women's rights and women's suffrage. And in fact, during the colonial era, there were several colonies that had actually extended suffrage to women. Those included Massachusetts, New York, and New Hampshire. But as the colonial period, really transitioned into more of the revolutionary period in American history, and after the Revolutionary War, those colonies, and then as they became the initial states, that right kind of disappeared. And so again, as this new country came into being after the Revolutionary War, and as they were embracing some of those new governance documents, none of the language in the original Constitution mentioned anything about a guarantee of suffrage for either men or for women. And so what that meant is that individual states at that point started implementing various rules, or you could say regulations, regarding the right to vote. Some required that to be able to vote, you had to own land, or you had to have lived in the state for a certain amount of time. Others implemented voting taxes. So again, there was nothing that was kind of a universal description as to who was allowed to vote and who was not. And during this time, again, going back to that idea that there are outliers in history, there were many women, there were a number of women, I will say, that were really allies and had positions within society to be vocal proponents of women's rights and women's freedoms. And of course, included in that was suffrage. One of the best remembered, or at least most visible, women from this time period who was pushing for women's suffrage was, of course, Abigail Adams. Now, she was the second First Lady of the United States, and what her interests focused on were really protections for women under any of the new laws that were being drafted as part of the new United States. And she was really a large proponent, or a strong proponent rather, for increasing access to formal education for women. And so on the screen, I've included one of her most famous quotes. It reads, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." And this was a letter that she had written to her husband, John Adams, in 1776. So well before he became president of the United States, and well before she became First Lady. But she was not the only woman to use her position within society to advocate for women's rights. Some of those other women who were vocal about women's rights included authors. I've included two of the names here. Judith Sargent Murray was an essayist, and she lived from 1751 to 1820. And she was an advocate for women's equality, also access to education, and really for women to have the right to control their earnings. One of her most famous essays was titled "On the Equality of Sexes." And again, in that piece, she really advocated for education for women, because it was education that she believed was vital to the success of the new nation. But of course, given the circumstances of the time, she did face opposition from a number of people who actually claimed that physically women's brains were not, they didn't grow essentially in the same way as a man's brain, and were therefore not capable of learning in the same way as a man. But of course, she countered this argument that it wasn't that women were stifled by physical limitations, but again, it was because of a lack of access to formal education. Another woman of note is Mary Wall Stonecraft, and she lived during a similar time period. She was born in 1759 and died in 1797. She was also a writer, and she advocated not only for education, but also for social equality for women. Also, like I said, she was a writer. Her most famous piece was titled A Vindication of the Rights of Women. She wrote that in 1792. Just a few years before her death. And in that, she again argued that men and women deserve to be educated equally, and that if women had access to those equal educational opportunities, then they would be positioned to be less frivolous and more capable. And that she really hoped that, in future women would have access and the ability to hold professions that men held, if only they were given the chance. And so again, even during the early 1800s, late 1700s, there were women advocating for themselves, for their own rights, and of course included in these conversations about access to education, and equality within a marriage or within a household, was discussions about having access and the right to vote. And so as the United States entered the 1800s or the 19th century, there were several things that kind of happened during those first few decades. Firstly, the divide that had existed or that was existing between the agricultural South and the industrial North, it began to widen and deepen. And of course, anti-slavery sentiments were growing during this period. And that was in part due to the Second Great Awakening. This was a period in time that lasted from about 1790 through the 1820s, and it was known as the Second Protestant Revival in the United States. And because of this movement, it was really, an effort on behalf of those who were very religious to encourage people to reform their lives. And as part of this movement, as part of the conversations that existed because of the movement, what we really see is that it served almost as a springboard for women to begin expressing their concern against gender inequality, in the church, but also gender inequality in society. And in fact, during this period, there were several women in the North who began to kind of see their lives in similar ways to those of enslaved people in the South, and that they were really shackled into society that was dominated by men. And so while we have this religious revival kind of happening kind of below the surface, if you will, what it ended up doing was really serving as the foundation for the development of several movements that would really take hold by the mid to late 1800s. And those included, of course, the women's rights movement, including suffrage, the abolitionist movement, which was a fight against slavery, and then the temperance movement, which attempted to ban alcohol consumption across the board. And so now coming back to the original supposed start date of women's suffrage with the Women's Rights Convention that happened in Seneca Falls, New York, I hope that you can all see that things in history can sometimes be a little bit messy, and it's not always as clean cut as something started on X date. But I will continue the story from here. By the 1840s, we have women who are really taking a more powerful role in their efforts to talk about suffrage, talk about women's rights, and really voice their opinion. And so enter essentially the Women's Rights Convention of Seneca Falls, New York. This convention took place over 2 days on July 19th and 20th of 1848. And there were actually 5 women who were the organizers of this event. They included Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucreta Moss, Mary McClintock, Martha Coffin Wright, and Jane Hunt. And really what these women were most frustrated by was a lack of opportunity for women in social, civil, and religious life. And During this convention, they had more than 300 people attend. They were mostly area residents. And during the first day, they only opened the convention to women. The second day, they invited male allies. But of those women that were instrumental in forming this convention and in leading it, Elizabeth Cady Stanton really comes to the forefront. She was an advocate of women's rights, and she actually authored the convention's seminal document, which they titled the Declaration of Sentiments. And in this document, Elizabeth actually borrowed language from some of the other governance documents of the United States. And so her Declaration of Sentiments opens with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." And throughout this document, she actually went on to highlight 19 specific abuses that she believed that women suffered, including a lack of voting rights, a lack of educational opportunities, their inferior role in the church, and the requirement that they be obedient to their husband, among many others. And as would be typical of today, anytime there was something kind of extraordinary happening, there was news coverage and media coverage. And you had newspapers that is, reporting on this convention all across the United States. And of course, some were proponents and supported this, and others were very much against it. But between 1848 and 1862, the participants who attended this convention used the Declaration of Sentiments really to rally support at their local level, and they petitioned state and national legislators as well on their behalf. And so I want to kind of take another step back here and remind everyone that even though we have these individual movements really building and taking shape around women's rights or around temperance or around abolition, the rest of the world was turning, essentially. You know, things were continuing to progress and develop elsewhere. And so I'm going to just touch on kind of three of the big things that were happening during the same time period. The first one was really this ideology that government and other leaders and proponents of westward expansion really rallied behind and used to their advantage. And that ideology was called Manifest Destiny. And this was the idea that white Anglo-Saxon men primarily were destined to really spread across the entire North American continent, bringing with them, as the picture on the slide depicts, technology and justice and the ideals of liberty as depicted by the floating woman in Greek or Roman attire. But the picture here also depicts that they were not necessarily marching out into an unoccupied land. They were really displacing thousands and thousands of native peoples, and that they were doing so again under this ideology that they were destined to do this. That ideology also played into some of the other international conflicts that were happening at the time, namely the Mexican-American War. This war actually concluded the same year of the Seneca Falls Convention, and President Polk was in office at the time, and he relied heavily on language from this Manifest Destiny idea to support U.S. involvement in that particular conflict. And of course, the Mexican-American War ended with the United States acquiring even more land out west. And then through the 1840s, 1850s, into the 1860s, again, that divide that I mentioned earlier between the agricultural South and the industrial North, it only continued to grow, and it culminated with the Civil War that extended from 1861 to 1865. It was bloody, it was horrific. But what that war resulted in was 3 additional amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And those amendments included the 13th Amendment, which declared that slavery was to be abolished. The 14th Amendment, which declared all persons born in the United States were citizens by birth. And the 15th Amendment extended voting rights, rather not extended, but protected voting rights, and that they could not be denied by race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so those were the things that were kind of happening in the background while the women's rights movement was really taking foot. And of course, I am the Idaho State historian, and this presentation is coming to you from the Idaho State Historical Society, and so I really want to bring the Idaho picture back into the conversation. And Idaho's, I guess, territorial history began really smack dab in the middle of all of this other conflict. In fact, Abraham Lincoln created Idaho Territory on March 4th, 1863, officially. And so by the time we reach the 1860s, a lot has happened, right? We've had, at least 80 years worth of kind of general conversations about the role that women play in society. We've had a bloody civil war. We have had really the foundations laid for the women's rights movement. The abolitionist movement had been successful, and the temperance movement was also still gaining ground. And during this period, if you look back at historic sources, newspapers in particular, you see that there is ongoing reporting on what they referred to as the women's question. And this is, of course, the kind of larger conversation of the women's rights movement, and more particularly the women's suffrage movement. And in fact, during the late 1860s, there were many Great Plains states and territories that had attempted to bring legislation to their state legislature to address this inequality, but in all of those cases, those states voted down any attempt to amend the suffrage laws. But on November 27th, 1869, the territorial legislature of Wyoming first introduced a suffrage bill, and less than a month later, on December 10th, that territory they voted in favor of that piece of legislation, and Governor John Campbell signed it into law, essentially making Wyoming the first state or territory to extend suffrage to women. And of course, Wyoming is not that far from Idaho, and given that these conversations were being reported on, and that the discussion of women's rights was kind of ongoing, especially out in the West, the conversation landed in the Idaho Territorial Legislature just 1 year later. In fact, on December 29, 1870, Representative Dr. Joseph William Morgan, who was an independent Democrat from Malad City in Oneida County, he first introduced House Bill 64 to the lower house of the Idaho Territorial Legislature. And he was really hoping to amend the election law by extending the elective franchise to women. He argued before the assembly that women really represented distinct members of government, that they were persons, citizens, and that therefore the laws affected them really in the same way as they affected enfranchised men. What ended up happening with Dr. Morgan's bill, it actually died in a tie vote, and I think that that is really telling as to the kind of spread of the discussion of suffrage. You know, this wasn't a one to everything else kind of vote. There were really people who were informed on the issue on both sides of the debate. And so after Dr. William Joseph Morgan's bill died in the Idaho Territorial Legislature, it's not as if suffrage in Idaho stopped. If anything, it was kind of the opposite. Several women across the state kind of picked up suffrage as a cause that was very dear to their hearts, something that they were passionate about. And they continued to have these kinds of conversations and push for women's equality and women's suffrage, but it was done more so at the grassroots movement, rather at the grassroots level, as a grassroots movement. And the women who were involved with this work, they were scattered throughout the state. Two of them are pictured on your screen here. We have Rebecca Mitchell and Abigail Scott Dunaway, but the other names that appear often in the historic record include Carrie Young and Henrietta Skelton. But I'll mention just briefly some of the history of the women that are pictured here. Abigail Scott Dunaway was originally from Illinois, but she moved to Oregon in 1852 with her family. And during her time in Oregon, her husband had a devastating accident, leaving him unable to work and support the family. And right before the accident, he had undertaken some bad business dealings, if you will, that really left the family in a very compromised situation. And these experiences really showed Abigail that women needed to have a bigger say in decisions that affected the family. Following her husband's accident, the family ended up moving to a larger town called Albany. And while she was there, she operated a boarding school and later a shop. And while running this kind of mercantile operation, she also heard from a number of other women who would come in also expressing their concern over their lack of voice, essentially, in their marriage or in social or civic life. And so she ended up moving the family to Portland and decided to start publishing a weekly newspaper devoted to suffrage called The New Northwest. She actually published this paper for a total of 16 years, and she became a lecturer and started traveling the country in support of women's suffrage. And she was of the idea that women deserved the right to vote as an inherent right. It wasn't connected to any other efforts such as temperance. And she ended up moving to Idaho in 1887 to Custer County. But before that, between 1876 and 1881, she gave over 140 speeches and lectures throughout Idaho, really touting the vote as, again, something that was an inherent right that women deserved. The other woman that's pictured on the screen is Rebecca Mitchell. And Rebecca was also from back east. She was from the Illinois area. She spent many years in Chicago. And while she was in Chicago, she received training as a Baptist missionary. But in 1882, she moved to Idaho Falls, which was at the time called Eagle Rock. And when she arrived there, she helped set up the First Baptist Church. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic, and then she taught Sunday school on Sundays. She was also instrumental in establishing the first chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Idaho Falls. She ended up becoming president of that organization, and in fact by 1899 she was really kind of a national figure within the temperance movement, and she was actually given a Lifetime Achievement Award from that organization. She actually went on kind of at a later date to hold a position as the chaplain of the Idaho State Legislature. So very active in religious and civic life, and was a large proponent of suffrage here in Idaho. But unlike Abigail, she was really tied to the idea that through suffrage she could achieve, and women could achieve efforts to enact temperance legislation. So from these two women, we kind of see that there were two distinct routes that suffragists took in an attempt to secure the vote. One really relied on recognizing that the right to vote was an inherent right of all citizens, while the other coincided with suffrage kind of as a means to an end, that with the vote they could enact other legislation that supported other causes. And thanks to the work of the women like Rebecca Mitchell, like Abigail Scott Duniway, Idaho began to implement and enact legislation that granted partial suffrage to women in Idaho. In fact, in 1879, the territorial legislature passed an act to establish a public school system, which granted unmarried tax-paying women the right to vote in school tax elections. And then in 1885, the territorial legislature amended that act to extend the right to vote in school elections to all women, and that also allowed them to hold elected positions as they related to school offices. But throughout this period, if we think again about kind of the era of suffrage in Idaho, if we say it started in 1870 with Dr. Joseph William Morgan and his legislation through 1896 when Idaho enacted a state constitutional amendment to extend suffrage to women. Really throughout almost the entirety of that time period, Idaho did not have a statewide or a national organization assisting with any of its suffrage efforts. So, going back to what I said about Rebecca and Abigail, that they were really kind of individual women doing individual work to continue the conversations about suffrage, what it really looked like on the ground, at least, was that it was a grassroots movement. In fact, Idaho did not receive support from even a statewide organization until 1895. And so what we see playing out on the ground is that, from this grassroots effort, you really have support of the movement from a lot of the southern regions of the state. There were Mormon strongholds that were incredibly pro-suffrage in their beliefs. And then on the opposite side, you have a lot of the mining towns throughout the state that were very much anti-suffrage. And that anti-suffrage sentiment stemmed primarily from fears that, by enacting suffrage and granting women the right to vote, temperance legislation would inherently follow. So despite the fact that there was an inability or a kind of a failure to bring suffrage to Idaho before Idaho became a state in 1890, there was still a lot of movement and a lot of support happening. It just wasn't happening in maybe the same organized fashion that we see suffrage happening in other states or other territories. But by 1895, the Idaho suffrage efforts had finally received recognition from some of the national organizations that had been working since the early 1870s. One of those organizations was called the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and it was actually the result of a merger of two of the other really large-scale recognized national groups. But that organization sent a veteran organizer to Idaho in the summer of 1895. Her name was Emma Smith DeVoe. She would go on to have success in supporting suffrage efforts in Washington. But Mrs. DeVoe really didn't have any sort of political allegiance, and she was also not going to agitate the temperance sect of the suffrage efforts here in the state. And so when she came to Idaho, she met with a number of suffrage leaders in the state and helped to organize the Idaho Equal Suffrage Association. And this was really Idaho's first statewide organized suffrage club or group. And from what you see on your screen here, these are original minutes of this organization. These are housed as part of a collection at the Idaho State Archives. And so this is a high-res scan of those handwritten minutes. But this organization was, again, instrumental in supporting suffrage at a statewide level. And really what their biggest success was, or what their work really resulted in, was that by 1896, they had successfully encouraged or advocated for suffrage to be accepted as a plank for all 4 of Idaho's political parties. So at the time, Idaho had 4 active political parties. They had a populist group, a Democratic group, the Republican group, and then they had a sect of that, the Silver Republicans. And again, this organization was able to convince all 4 of those political parties to embrace suffrage as part of their campaign. And so really what the work of all of these individual suffragists and the Idaho Equal Suffrage Association and support from those national groups, what that meant here in Idaho was that the Idaho legislature was finally able to vote and approve language for a state constitutional amendment. And they were able to bring that to the ballot for Idahoans to take action on in November of 1896. And as a result of that vote, it was very clear on paper that the amendment should pass. There were 12,126 yes votes in favor of a proposed state constitutional amendment to enact suffrage for women, against 6,282 no votes. But this election ended up having a number of other issues on the ballot that received higher total votes overall. And so when the Board of Canvassers, which was the entity responsible for counting votes and confirming the results of an election, when they looked at all of these numbers together, they made a decision that the 12,000 yes votes in support of this amendment did not constitute a majority of the total number of people who voted on other issues on the same ballot. And so this issue and this question of was it a majority or was it not, ended up going all the way to the Idaho State Supreme Court, where those 3 male justices heard arguments on each side and ultimately decided that a non-vote on an issue did not constitute a no vote. So just because they didn't vote on it didn't mean that they were against it. And so on December 11th, 1896, the Idaho State Supreme Court upheld the vote in the majority, thus enacting suffrage for women. And here on the screen we have clips from the very next day from the Idaho Daily Statesman announcing that women now had the right to vote in Idaho. And so once women had the right to vote here in Idaho, a number of things happened, and it was pretty immediate to see the influence that women had at the ballot box, essentially, and how seriously they really took having this right to vote. So in the very next election, in 1898, when the next election happened, Idaho elected 3 women to the Idaho State Legislature, and those women are pictured here on the screen. We have Harriet Noble, who was from Boise County, Mary Allen Wright, who was from Kootenai County, and then Clara Campbell, who was from Boise. And these 3 women served in the legislature, same as any of the men who had been elected. They drafted legislation, they attended committee sessions, and they represented their constituents. In addition to these three women, we also had another woman who had been elected to a state position. She became the first woman state superintendent of public instruction. Her name was Permille French. And as I mentioned earlier, Rebecca Mitchell, who had been again active in the suffrage movement and active in the temperance movement, she became chaplain of the Idaho State Legislature and held that position until 1908. And in addition to voting and serving in office here in Idaho, a number of women who had been active in the suffrage movement leading up to 1896 continued in their efforts in order to support suffrage efforts elsewhere. Pictured here on the screen is actually a photograph of an artifact that is housed in our Idaho State Museum collection. This is a silk and satin hand-painted banner from 1913. This banner represented Idaho in some of those national suffrage efforts. In fact, it was an artifact that came from the Idaho Council of Women Voters. One of Idaho's, I think, most incredible historic women, Margaret Roberts, is the woman who donated this artifact to the Historical Society. And she was also very active in the Idaho Council of Women Voters, which was an organization that formed in 1911 as an additional national group that was really instrumental in bringing the 19th Amendment to the point of ratification. And so I think what this artifact really shows, and what, kind of the continued story of suffrage here shows, is that we in Idaho didn't stop our work simply because women here received the vote. If anything, we recognized that we were very privileged in receiving the vote before so many others. And so we used that place of privilege to fight for the rights of others. And so this brings us to the end of this presentation. Again, all of the work that suffragists did throughout the 19-teens did impact and influence the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And in fact, Idaho became the 30th state to ratify that proposed suffrage amendment. Our legislature came together as part of a special session in 1920 to take action on that piece of legislation. And on February 11th of 1920, they voted in the House unanimously to support ratification. And in the Senate, there were, I believe, 6 senators who voted against that effort. But I think the story of women in Idaho and the story of suffrage more generally is one that deserves, some additional research and additional attention, because it is such a long-standing fight, right? If you, again, go back to that thought of how something starts and stops, even if you look at that 1848 to 1920 period, that's more than 70 years of work, and it represented the efforts of millions of women across the country and really across the world. And so I hope that throughout the rest of 2020, scholars and researchers and other staff, even here at the Idaho State Historical Society, can continue to devote time and effort to this topic so that we can really understand the nuances that exist in the story and shed a more honest and authentic light on the topic of suffrage history. So again, thank you so much for taking the time today to join me for this presentation. I sincerely hope that you learned something new and that you maybe have sparked some interest in digging into this topic a bit more. Please feel free to reach out to me directly via email or reach out to the agency via any of our social media channels. We would be happy to engage with you on this topic. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again so much.